Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, which is disabled artists discussing how they work with digital, and it's brought to you by The Space. I think there's still some people joining us, but for now, let's start. I'm Linda, I'm the webinar producer. I'm a white woman with shoulder-length hair, wearing glasses and a blue jumper. I'm going to tell you about what the webinar offers and how we'll work. If you're new to the space, to let you know, we are the UK's digital commissioning and development agency for the arts and the cultural sector. We've commissioned more than 300 digital projects, of which two are the case studies that we'll be covering and looking at today. And more than 800 organisations have accessed the sector support which we offer, which includes these webinars. So to tell you a bit about how we work, Jen is our live captioner, and you can access live captions if that's helpful by going to the bottom of the screen and clicking on the CC/live transcript button and selecting show subtitle. And we have Rachel and Samaya, our BSL interpreters. If you would like to work with Rachel and Samaya and BSL, tell us using the chat function so that we can enable you to pin their windows. We use the chat quite a lot for conversation between the audience and the team. So please feel free to join that. And for asking specific questions to the panelists, we'll use the Q&A function. If it's difficult for you to use the Q&A or to use the chat, please raise your hand and we can unmute you. Alt-Y is the keyboard shortcut to raise your hand if that's helpful. Do bear in mind that if you speak out loud in the webinar, you'll be included in the recording. So we record the webinar and then it's available on our website for 6 months following this. We also have a list of all the shortcuts you can use in Zoom. If that would be useful to you in any way, if there's a particular shortcut that would help you, let us know in chat and we'll try to help. I'm now going to show you the slide that explains the plan for this session. Very simply, as you'll understand, I'm doing the introduction now, and then I'll be inviting my colleague Harmeet Chagger-Khan, the producer with The Space, to talk about why The Space think this is important. Then I'll be handing to our facilitator, Barbara Lisicki, and she will introduce our speakers, our 3 speakers, Maria, Al and Zoe, and they'll talk a bit about their work, and then we'll sort of open up into a more general conversation about how artists use digital in their work. Then we have a 5-minute break, and the second part, we're looking more at the needs of disabled artists and disabled audiences. And then we'll be joined by Zoe again and Maria. And we'll be closing at 12:30. And just to say before that, during that time, we'll also invite you to fill in an evaluation form, but we'll get to that at the point about 12:20. So that's the plan for this morning. And as I said, I'm going to invite Harmeet to share her face and unmute herself. And Harmeet, to kick us off really, can you give us a sense of how the work that you're doing is relevant to this webinar and why this is an important area for The Space as a commissioning organisation?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. I'm Harmeet Chagger-Khan. I'm digital producer at The Space. I'm a British Indian female in a small office with a bookshelf to my left. I'm wearing a green jumper and there is a poster beside me that says, "Kindness is love," with his work boots on. So as I mentioned, I'm digital producer at The Space, and I specialise in looking at projects which have innovative digital content that builds new audiences. And I think the reason why this is important for The Space is because actually when we think about reaching audiences through digital arts and culture, it's really easy to assume that digital content will reach everyone, that it reaches the parts that other art forms can't reach. But, because we all have access to a laptop or a phone, or actually we can listen to, some digital audio. But actually it's more of a layered approach, really. And it's thinking about how we can support organizations in thinking about that layered approach to embed that in right from the start. So actually, we've been working with Zoe Partington, who you'll hear from in a while, and we've been looking at really how can we establish digital accessibility standards for publishing digital art, and what can organizations do to implement that right from the start as an automatic behavior. Some of those things that might seem really obvious in terms of creating a film or a piece of interactive content or an animation or some, an audio piece. And then actually realizing that to think about how audiences can access that, what is the access provision for audiences who want to reach it? It's about implementing that right from the start. So it's about thinking about how will you do the audio description so that actually people can access that piece of work in a far richer way? Or how can you make sure that if you're disseminating your work and you're creating a webinar, that people can access the work because there are interpreters and captions available? And I think one of the things that we can do as commissioners is that we can support the organizations who want to create that content right from the start. So it's about embedding that in really early on, and actually making it obvious that it's an easy thing to do as long as we put that into the production pipeline. I think one of the reasons why it's also really, really important right now is that when we think about the kinds of work that we want to hear or see or experience, what we're really talking about is how does arts and culture reflect society? And the truth is that we might turn around and say, well, this is me as an artist, and these are the kinds of stories that I want to tell. But the reality is that we all have different experiences, and to hear those stories from people who, have different lived experiences, who don't look like us, who don't sound like us, what that does is it creates universal truths that we can all connect with. And that's super important right now, in terms of enabling a richer platform for people to understand, our place in the world, but also actually to create more empathy and compassion. I think that's what we need to enable more now than ever. And so what we're working on right now, as well as commissioning organizations and supporting artists with disabilities who want to create trailblazing work, is that we are looking at a set of guiding principles, working with organizations to make sure that they are not only commissioning artists with disabilities, that they're curating and programming work, and then actually when they are making that work with those artists, that they have the support process and the production pipeline to enable the audiences to access that work completely and fully when they see it on a digital platform.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that. So really sort of setting the scene and seeing how this is important to us. And at this point, so Harmeet will be sort of around, and she'll be involved in the chat. And if so, there might be some questions that come your way, Harmeet, but we're not really expecting to see you again through the webinar until the end. Thank you very much. And just to say, audience, I think we've got a bit of a technical hitch in that a Q&A function. I said to put questions into the Q&A function, but it's not enabled. So we'll be asking you to put the questions into chat, and then I'll share them with Barbara from there. So over to Barbara now. Barbara Lisicki is our facilitator today. She's going to introduce herself and then bring in our panelists. So I'll hand to you now. Thanks, Barbara.
Okay, cheers, Linda. Hi, everybody. Yeah, my name's Barbara Lisicki, also known as Vanda Barbara, which is my stage name. I do training, but I'm also a comedian, and I was recently the subject of a BBC drama documentary called Then Barbara Met Alan, which you can still see on iPlayer and also on Netflix. But I've got blonde chin length hair cut in a bob, and I'm wearing specs so I can see her, and I've got sort of dark eyes and red lips. And I'd like to just introduce you to our three guests, our three speakers. Before the break, we're going to hear from two of them, but the three speakers are Maria Ashodi, and Maria is going to introduce flight paths, and we will find out from Maria about how the idea evolved and why she wanted to create an online experience. And then we've got Al Davison, and he's going to introduce muscle memory and tell you more about that. And after our break, we'll be speaking with Zoe Partington and find out more about Zoe's work. So yeah, that's we've got a lot to get through. So I'll move forward and bring in Maria, please.
Hi, thank you, Barbara, and hello, everybody. So I'm a middle-aged, brown-skinned, biracial, blind woman. My pronouns are she, her. And I've got brown, sort of messy, kind of curly hair, wearing some headphones that I've just knocked. I've got some wire framed glasses on there, particularly for protecting my eyes rather than seeing through, because I've got very, very limited vision. And I'm wearing a red shirt and a little kind of amber necklace. So that's me. I'm a CEO and artistic director of a company called Extant. And Extant has been around for quite a while now, 25 years. I founded the company, and we call ourselves a kind of radical space to interrogate what performing arts mean to visually impaired people as receivers and makers. And that means it's taken us into lots of really interesting territory over those 25 years, from researching really simple, nuanced stuff in the early days around our physicality on stage, and how that could be something that we worked with in a interesting and interesting ways that meant that we weren't covering up who we were as visually impaired people, how we could make our movement relevant in terms of our access on stage, but also in terms of the patterns and the choreography that we kind of moved around and examined the stage with, to doing kind of, big touring productions, experimental arts tech kind of productions that sort of looked at challenging form and place in terms of visual impairment, and theatre, challenging this idea of spectacle. Was that the main dynamic that needed to take place within theatre, or could it be coming from somewhere else? So those are all things that we've been doing over the last 25 years, which has been great. Such an adventure. I never thought when we set up the company, and this is like the tiny little kind of enclave of visually impaired performers, that we'd be kind of embarking on such a kind of a wondrous, exciting, some often difficult, but sometimes really enlightening kind of experience. That's been great. So one of the things that we worked on, and often our work, we do a lot of work that we have an idea. It seems quite uncharted, and so we set up R&Ds, research and developments, to start to kind of tread carefully through this idea and see what it brings up. Sometimes these R&Ds go on for years, as with flight paths that I'm here to talk about. We started actually with this idea back in 2013, and it came out of a production that Extant had done called Sheer in 2012, and in that we had included some aerial work and audio description. Hadn't experienced this before in terms of circus kind of aerial movement on silks, with blind aerialists actually giving their description of themselves from, when they're sort of in performance. All of Extant's work tries to embed access within the productions themselves. I'm trying to get away, and not saying there's anything wrong with audio description in the traditional sense of wearing headphones and stuff, but that sometimes that's a kind of a barrier physically to live performance. So we try to, where we can, bring it in a live way, and often giving the blind performer agency to deliver that audio description themselves, write it themselves, you know, and be in control rather than kind of like outsourcing it to a sighted person to do it for us. So that's what we did in Sheer. We had the blind aerialists delivering the audio description themselves, and that was fine in a indoor setting, in a theatre. The audience could hear the performer, it was fine. I as a person of colour, was part of something called Sustain Theatre, which was a gathering, bringing together of theatre companies that were led by people from, you know, Black and Asian backgrounds.
Maria, sorry, just to let you know, you've got about a minute left.
Oh my gosh, you're joking.
No,
oh my
5
goodness.
minutes in total.
Right, so collaboration between Vicky Amadumo from Upswing, Kamiko Mendel from Yellow Earth, and ourselves. 6 years of R&D led to us creating a touring production which involved blind performers telling their stories of travel to the UK. And we did it, we presented all this within a framework of this historic tradition of the Japanese Gozei women who travelled medieval Japan, making their livings from storytelling and playing musical instruments. Production that included projections and aerial work and spatialized sound, which was bespoke, created for the production. We had all these digital... Sorry, I keep getting these messages on the chat. We created all of this, and then we toured it, and then we had it, and we thought, what next? Well, you know, we saw the opportunity from the space to create something new out of kind of created assets that you had from production, and we thought, you know, what might be great for this, because it had been on a limited tour. It would be fantastic if we could create something that was
Maria, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap.
Yes, online, and so we did, and that's Flight Paths, and I'll come back to it later.
Okay, thanks. You'll have an opportunity when people come in with questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so next I'm going to bring in Al. So Al, if you could brief introduction and description of yourself and talk about muscle memory, the project that you're going to talk about this morning.
Hello, I'm Al. A 62-year-old white man. I'm wearing an orange fleece, a grey hat, and I have a grey beard. Sort of middle-aged Santa Claus, basically. I'm a comic artist and creator, and I've been working in comics since the late 80s, early 90s. I had a first volume of my autobiography was published called Spiral Cage, which was about living with the experience of growing up with a disability, being born with spina bifida. I started working about 15, 20 years ago on a second volume, but was unable to find a publisher at the time, so I started putting it online. And then a couple of years ago, at the beginning, working through the City of Culture in Coventry, I got a micro commission via Unlimited to work on an example of my autobiography dealing with disability hate crime. And then I got the opportunity through, again, Unlimited and the space to develop this into a bigger project, to, again, explore further the ideas and issues around my own experiences of hate crime. And I was particularly felt that it was relevant because hearing a lot of the conversations, disability was often left out of the conversation, I felt. And I know I wasn't offering any answers as such. I was trying to get the conversation moving by showing my own experiences. And then we decided that it would be helpful in trying to expand my audience from people who just traditionally read comics, to try and make it more accessible to more people. So we decided to create a multimedia version with the current chapter of the book dealing with these issues. So we're adding in animation, audio, but we're trying to make the audio more interesting than purely, the normal description that you get. We're trying to make it more dramatic. So we've been recording dramatized audio, combining this with visual mixes of the artwork for people who are maybe dyslexic and they can't read the comic in the normal way, and just trying to be aware that people experience storytelling in lots of different ways. It's still ongoing, and inevitably when you're trying to develop things like this, we're still finding that we have some technical issues in terms of getting everything to work for everybody, or as many people as we can. So that's the main challenge. But it's quite an exciting project, and so far getting a lot of positive feedback.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much, Al. Good. So, yeah, you're just slightly under your time, but that's very great. So, we're going to, oh, yes. Okay. So you've got in the chat, the links to, websites, and you also in your joining instructions, you'll have had links to people's work. So do feel free to look at that. So if anybody's got questions, I can't see any in chat at the moment, but I'd like you to put them in the chat if you can, please. So yeah, okay. I haven't got any at the moment. So if for us to, I mean, I can bring Zoe in next if that would help, but while we wait for people to ask questions, and then maybe if we'd because we want to make this interactive, but we're doing it via the medium of chat so that it helps us to move through this efficiently. But we really would like to hear from you, so all the people that are in, please do. Yeah. So, I mean, there's people saying that they're finding it interesting and want to hear more. And that's really good. If you ask questions, then the artists will talk more. So that's the way to do it. So
Barbara,
please do. Yeah.
Yeah, shall I just introduce very quickly
So
then?
yeah, let's go for it. Let's bring you
While
in, and then we'll see
questions
what
are
the
coming in.
questions are.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah, just to say hello, I'm Zoe Partington. I did have fiery red hair, but I now have blonde hair in a bob with my headphones on, obviously with a black polo neck, which is the usual dress sense. And just to say that I absolutely love being able to work with digital technology and digital art. I live in a very rural location, so there's all sorts of reasons why digital accessibility is fantastic and incredibly useful for people to hear us, to know who we are, and to know why we exist. And I also do a lot of work around asking the questions about when it doesn't work, what are we all going to do about it, and how do we find those solutions, sometimes as individuals, sometimes as organizations, but sometimes collectively as well. So what are those things, like Linda was saying and Harmeet was saying, that need to be in place to enable that to happen? And the reason for that is because artistically, we can create unique things working with disabled artists and to use accessibility in creative ways. So it's not just about the functionality side. I think that's the bit, and I'm sure Maria and Al will agree, it's about how we creatively enable fantastic content and stories and insights to happen through a digital process, really. So that's why access is really important, but I think bridging that gap between access and artistic endeavour is where we all want to be, really. And sometimes I think we forget that when we talk about functionality, but it has to be both, I believe, and I'm sure lots of people believe that as well. And that's how we can all be in it and all part of it. I think it's really important to recognise that.
Okay, is that are you done, Zoe?
Yes, yeah, because I think we need to get into questions.
Yeah.
don't
Well, we have got some questions now, which is great. So one of the questions we've got is that Al and Maria, actually all of you, could you talk about what the digital tools and technologies do that allow you to create stuff that you couldn't do otherwise? And yeah, if you start with that one. Maria first.
The digital tools that I use to enable me to do things that I wouldn't do otherwise.
Yeah.
Is that I don't understand the question. Is that in relation to like or this particular project? Because I mean,
well, talk about it in relation to this project, and then maybe if people have got follow-up questions, they can.
Okay, I mean, it's pretty. What I use generally to allow me to access anything is my speech technology, and that if I didn't have that, I wouldn't be able to do anything. So that's the big sort of problem solver.
Mm-hmm.
That comes into use for every project I do. The thing that is specific, I mean, the project of Flight Paths is such a complicated project and so involved and has gone on for so long to get to this point where we created the thing that you can experience online at a flick of a switch. It's really and there were so many people that were involved in it as well. I kind of sort of don't know where to start. So that's why I find the question a bit tricky. So in short, JAWS helps me to do things that I wouldn't ordinarily be able to do, but that's not really an answer to Flight Paths, really.
Okay,
so
thanks. It's okay. I'll move on. Al, have you got anything you'd like to add briefly? And then we've got some questions coming in, so we'll move on to those.
Well, just to say that, I mean, I wouldn't be working today if it wasn't for technology, because many years ago I developed problems with my arms and I was told by my doctor I'd have to stop drawing. But it was a therapist who recommended I get a graphics tablet because I could adjust the pressure on the pen, and that would allow me to work in a way that I could still draw without having the issues with my arms. So I'm only working today because of that technology, and I've tried to advance that and work with that further into this project.
Okay, thank you very much. Somebody's asked, Zoe, can you just introduce who you are as well as what you look like? In other words, just a few sentences about the work that you do.
Yes, and of course, I suppose, well, I'm a disabled artist, but I also work as a consultant, trainer and auditor, I suppose. So a lot of the work as an artist, I create installations using digital technology. Some of those are online. Some of those are audio pieces in galleries and spaces. Quite recently, I've developed something called Decoding Difference, which is at Bush House at the moment. And it's a digital piece, which is basically, I feel like a bit like I'm a cyborg. I have an insulin pump and I have a Dexcom sensor. And that sensor, I programmed the lighting installation to link to my sensor. So the glucose levels change quite, dramatically all the time within my body. But the lighting installation does the same. But I also work trying to encourage organizations to use digital technology with disabled artists, as performers, as poets, as visual artists. And that can sometimes be because the disabled artist can't travel regularly, or they might have a chronic condition and they need to be in contact with that organization in different ways. So it's about, just using flexibility in the best way, in a digital way. And I said, living in a rural location, I can't go to the theatre as regularly as I'd like to, because I'm, visually impaired. I can't drive there. But if I can tune in to watch a show, that's absolutely fantastic. It gives me access that I never used to have, 30 years ago.
Well, people were sort of pushed into it during COVID and lockdown, is that all the theatres had to find alternative ways of, getting what they were doing out there. And I think that was quite a good time that year for digital development of all sorts of different art forms that just didn't exist prior to that. in any meaningful way. So, you know, you've got NT at home and all those, National Theatre at home and all those kinds of things now that are going. So yeah.
And I think that is about the expansion of that, isn't it? Because I think sometimes, you know, we always say this, you don't know what you don't know. So ask disabled artists, you know, the quality of the performance, did it work for you? If it didn't, what can we do to enhance it? And we know this, you know, what tends to happen is the more accessible some artwork is, or the content that you're producing and the representation of disabled artists in that work, it means that other people can access it in much better ways as well. And it works for all of us.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to put a couple of questions out to you all, but if you can just sort of answer them in a minute or two. First one is, how do we create a digital offer that is truly accessible? And how do we manage expectations in this respect? So if I can bring Al in on that.
I'm not quite sure I fully understand. Could you repeat the?
Well, the question is, how do we create a digital offer that is truly accessible? How do we manage expectations in this respect?
Right. Well, that's, again, I think it's down to getting feedback from various different the audiences as much as possible, looking at the different ways and people need to access things, whether it's through sound or purely visual, and we have to keep exploring, experimenting and asking for feedback all the time in order to get something that works for as many people as possible. Okay,
so basically you ask for feedback and alter what you're doing according to what people tell you.
Yes, as best as you can, you know, just keep having that conversation.
What sort of channels of feedback are you using?
Well, it's posting, contacting people who experience storytelling in different ways, asking them to tell me what works, what doesn't work, that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Maria, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, completely. Because I mean, you know, this has been the whole raison d'etre of Extant from the very start, is that, you know, we've just turned access inside out and made that the complete reason for what we do, how we do it, and how we can do it in varied and different ways in a whole range of settings. So we always, you know, it's the same. It's like any production will have, you know, some basic tenets, you know, around it. You know, you'll have your music, your actors, your light, whatever it is, and access is part of that. It doesn't get bolted on afterwards. So, I mean, one of the questions I saw in the chat was physically how we brought something from the physical realm into the digital, and that involved, you know, a whole fresh team of people working with us, like a producer, an editor, a web designer, and consultant, an animator, an illustrator, and we knew that access was going to be really important from the very, very beginning of all that, and we'd included it in a very unusual way in the physical production, but we knew that wasn't going to be enough for the online retelling of this work, and so we thought of the animated kind of guide that was going to be introduced to this new digital version as being the way that we would do that. And so it meant that within the script for that animated figure, there needed to be incorporated access, particularly for visually impaired people who are going to be connecting with this thing, and also how the navigation would work, because we were trying to create an experience where the audience would interact as a journey person through this experience. So we needed to know that all the keys, the key instructions would work on a computer as well as on a mobile phone. And that all involves, like as we do with everything we do in Extant, like always bringing in visually impaired kind of consultants to feed back to us, who've got a range of visual impairment, you know, because no one person is the same and everybody uses their screens in different ways. and we bring them in at several points as well. So we do, we do a bit of work, we then consult, we take the feedback, we integrate it into the next stage, and that all takes time. And that's also something that really needs to be understood from the very start of any project that was taking access seriously, is that you need to build in the time in order to develop it alongside whatever it is, whatever it is that you're creating.
Thank you, Maria. Okay, I've got another question here. It's quite long, but there's a sort of bit of introduction. So it's from Lauren at Rural Media. And Lauren says, we've been working on talent development programs for the past few years and have just started developing a bespoke program enabling disabled artists to use film and digital media to find new audiences, try new things, and develop their practice. So can the panelists share their experiences of developing their career, especially any mid-career challenges? And and Lauren also says that they're actively looking for partners to develop this program. So please feel free to get in touch, and there's an email address there in the chat, which can be part of what is available afterwards. So yeah, so the question is basically, how do you develop your work and your digital work, and share your experiences of developing your career, especially around mid-career. Okay, Zoe, do you want to go first on that if you can?
Okay. I suppose trying to think, yes, what was I think for me it's about access to people supporting your practice, so that and Lauren will know this at Rural Media, being in a rural area, don't have access to, like sometimes in cities, digital learning programs and educators that can work with you. And sometimes trying to learn about skills, digital skills, for Adobe or for illustrators or all sorts of things like that. When you're visually impaired, it's not always as accessible to you as you'd like it to be. And I suppose that one of the breakthroughs for me was to just keep trying myself and developing ways and techniques of using digital technology. But I think Maria's alluded to this as well, is to have the funding and the confidence to work with other people that support you and don't take over. And that also comes with confidence. So me as an artist, I can work with other people now and still me be in control. It's my concept, my idea. And that can be very difficult sometimes, because sometimes people take over when actually you want them technically to help you get it right. So I suppose it's working with organizations that listen, understand that, and enable you with them to get your creative concept and ideas, across. But as a practicing artist, you've got to be really confident so you can hold on to that, really, because it's very easy for that to be taken away from you by somebody else. And I hear about it, from disabled artists in all art forms, not just using digital technology. So it's the trust thing, it takes a while to build that trust. And I think, one of the things is when you start to get funding, that enables you to, to buy other people in. And we all know that. But as a freelance disabled artist, sometimes trying to make that happen and covering all your costs of accessibility as well can be quite hard.
Thank you. Yeah, well, that was quite a big debate sort of several years ago with the Arts Council, that there needed to be a separate access budget to the budget of the work, that it couldn't be, you couldn't take out you couldn't use your main budget for accessibility as well, because otherwise you use up lots of the budget for the access that when it's been allocated for other types of working. So yeah, we did get there in the end, so that was good.
And I think to say, Barbara, that was over 20 years ago that happened, didn't it? Because myself and Barbara and other people that were supporting that at Halton Lee, Tony Heaton, ran a program with disabled artists, wasn't it, to make films and get them to understand how to fill in Arts Council application forms. And we realised very quickly at that point we needed to have that conversation with Arts Council that access shouldn't be part of that 15,000 limit that it used to be. It needed to be separate from that. And that was, you know, it sounds mad, doesn't it? But just a huge step forward.
Yeah, and it wasn't a given. I mean, you know, we had to push for it quite hard. So, but anyway, you know, it shows that we can make progress when we put forward the ideas. Okay, I've got some more questions here. This is a question for both Maria and Al. Can you chat more about the creative audio description that you mentioned that goes beyond the very basic literal descriptions? I find this really an interesting question as well. How do you balance keeping the clarity and meaning while also creating experiences that goes further? So I'll start with Al and then move to Maria. Just 1 or 2 minutes each, please, maximum.
Well, yeah, well, that's an interesting challenge because this is a fairly new area for me. Most of my career has been spent working pencil on paper or purely drawing. So developing work with the audio has been a particularly interesting approach. I got inspired because of a producer who does a lot of audio work called Dirk Maggs, and he's an incredible audio producer and director, and that really inspired me. And I wanted to try and find a way of giving people a full experience with the audio, so it'd be like a dramatic, you know, like listening to an audio play, and also as cinematic as possible with the sound effects and the Foley on it, so that people can feel the full experience and make it as immersive as possible. I'm still at the stage where we're trying to find the best way of making that also work fully functionally in terms of with screen readers and that kind of thing. So we're still in a very much a steep learning curve with that. But I think it's really interesting and useful to try and create something that's as rich an experience for people to experience, rather than just being purely functional, recreating what's happening, but to try and make it really immersive. But as I say, we're still in the middle of that, so we're trying to work out how to do that effectively. Okay,
Maria, maybe if you could give us an example rather than the sort of how to, just a brief example of, you know, creative audio.
Well, I think I talked about it just in my previous answer, and that was how we got the animated Gozei, who is the you know, the traditional blind Japanese traveller, within the digital version of Flight Paths, to be the audio describer as well as commentator and guide for the audience. So that's how we did it in that. So if you go and experience Flight Paths after that, the first thing you will be met is with Take, who is this beautiful animated figure who will take you through the experience and describe what's going on screen, what she looks like, the landscape, and also like I say, there were parts. The nuance of it is that we filmed the production of Flight Paths when it was touring binaurally, and then we took some of those binaural, which means a spatialized kind of recording, sort of 3D recording of the show. And we took some of those aspects of the film and we embedded it into the digital version of it. So if you like experience Flight Paths digitally or with headphones, you'll get a 3D sort of sound as well. And that was really important for some of these aerial sequences that we created, where in the physical space we had amplified the performers so we could hear their voices from where their bodies were in space. And this is a really important thing, that if you're visually impaired, you often audio description, if it comes out of a speaker, you turn your head to where the speaker is, and that may not be where the performers are. So we reconstituted that within the physical tour to have the voices amplified from the performers' bodies in space, and then that comes through in the digital version as well. The other thing I wanted to just quickly say was about subtitles, because we wanted to make it accessible for the deaf and people who are hard of hearing as well. And we brought subtitles into the films that are part of this experience, the Flight Path experience. But when we created them, to make them large enough for people who are partially sighted to see meant that a lot of the screen got blocked out. So then we had to work it in another way, so the subtitles were contrasted really clearly and could be made smaller, so that when they're available on screen, they don't block out too much of the visual action. And we've got, as part of Flight Paths, a subtitled and a non-subtitled version as well. And it's all there at the beginning in the menu, and it's really clear, and it works with screen readers like JAWS, or if you're using VoiceOver on your phone. And it just means that everybody, whether they're, whatever their sort of sensory impairment or non-impairment, can at the very get-go have their accessible journey through this experience.
Thank you. We've reached a point where we're going to take a break. I've got a couple of more questions, but we'll bring them in after the break. And also, after the break, we're going to be looking at sort of, the different, understanding what different digital platforms offer, and what's lacking, and also what changes the panel would like. But we're going to break now for 5 minutes. So it's 11:47. So in 5 minutes exactly, we will be back and continue so that we can, start to look at how to move forward. And there's a couple more questions, which I can ask you afterwards. Okay, thank you, everybody. And don't go away. Or
I was just going to say, I think Al's going to leave us now. So I wanted to say thanks to Al for joining us for that first part.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Take care now.
Okay, we're back. Yeah, 4 minutes is up. Hopefully it was long enough to make a brew or grab a drink. So yeah, thanks. So we covered quite a bit in already, but I just want to move on to looking at the sort of what digital platforms offer in arts and culture, and what's lacking, what else sort of needs to be out there. And when you'll each get like a minute or two to summarize just before we move into the sort of evaluating the session. So if you can start to think about what changes you'd like to see, maybe one change each, and talk a bit about, you know, the collaboration and the collaborations also, and what are the issues around collaborating, both good and problematic. I think you've already talked about that a bit, but if you've got anything to add on that, that would be excellent. So yeah, can I bring in well, we've got Maria and Zoe still here, so maybe Zoe, can you talk a bit about sort of, you know, what's lacking in and what you'd like to see, and also maybe something about the issues around collaborating, creative collaborations.
Yeah, I mean, I think a major thing, which, you know, we're all working on also behind the scenes, is somewhere the accessibility of the software for the digital interventions that we're using. And sometimes those, because sometimes disabled people aren't working on the software teams with the companies that produce these things, quite simple things are missed and not built into that software. And you know, this goes back down really, I think, to disabled people being present in all parts of society and all the functions that happen. I think if, for example, you know, using VR technology and things like that, there needs to be more conversations really and dialogue with disabled people that are using those bits of kit and equipment, so that the access can be built in. And you know, it's the same for things like, you know, Zoom and Teams. I still find Teams quite difficult as a visually impaired person. I find Zoom a little bit easier. But a lot of these digital things have still got certain things missing. And even when, and it was fantastic obviously during COVID, when some of the larger galleries were, you know, streaming or showing their gallery spaces online, and you could go on a tour of the gallery, even though there was nobody inside these big institutions at that time. There were films, they'd show you, they'd scan round and look at a lot of this work. But the only bit that worked for me was when the curator and maybe the artist were having a discussion about the work, but people still forgot to tell you actually what was on the walls, what did it look like, and how, what were they, you know, what were they, I mean, I knew you could get a lot from the context and the interpretation, but I still didn't have a clue what was on that actual wall. And sometimes you get that in films and sometimes you get that in the performance. So I think it's people understanding it from our perspective, what else needs to be added in. And when we try and have those conversations, you know, people say, oh yes, but I think I want more than yes. I want people to go, okay, well, let's draw a few people together that have different experiences. Let's listen to what they say, and then let's input it. So it's about the action. You know, I sort of need that action to happen. And sometimes, you know, as a disabled person, I suppose because I've been freelance for a long time, it might be different from Maria, but I don't think it is. I can sort of say what I like, because I'm not, you know, I can say I'm not happy with that, it's not working, or I don't feel that I'm going to lose opportunities to work in this field. I mean, I've been working with disabled curators who are terrified of saying what's not working in those large institutions, because they feel that they're not going to get work, or they're not going to be part of that network. And it should be really about honesty, not about anybody saying anything wrong. It should be, let's be really open to try and look at the solutions. And generally, you know, the arts and culture sector and the heritage sector is about solutions, but I think we need more solutions. What was the second part you asked me? Sorry, Barbara.
Well, it's no, that's fine, Zoe. I mean, you've
Okay.
answered quite a lot of it. So just, but as we start to wrap, if you start thinking about, you know, I mean, you've already suggested a change, I think, but any specific change you'd like to see. So maybe a space within organisations that you know, these things can be raised. Maria, have you got anything to?
It was really interesting listening to Zoe there, and I think that there's a lot that resonates. I think that the thing about being a sort of a freelancer and a small organisation, I kind of think it's kind of interesting because obviously, the larger institutions have more of the resources and more of the profiling, and so the kind of onus in a way is on them to be sort of leading the way, when often that's not really the case. Sometimes, it's within smaller fleet of foot organizations and individual artists that are really making some fantastic kind of developments around access, and I think there needs to be more of a bridge between the two, really, and ways that kind of that kind of innovation can be adopted within the larger organizations. I mean, the great thing about working for Extant and why it's held me, somebody like me, is quite mercurial and likes to see change quite quickly and wants to see the register, of my experience out there. I stayed in the company because even though we only might be working in a tiny little corner, at least we can influence change there. And then if that ripples out, great, but I think that is something, we can't be kind of like taking on also doing all the campaigning, and then, we can do a bit, but we also want to do the work. We want to do the work. We want to do the work that comes from our lived experience, because who else is going to do that? No one else is going to do it. So that's my main priority. And then all the rest is just a byproduct, but that needs to be sort of taken on elsewhere. The other part of the question was about working in collaboration, wasn't it? Yeah. And I think that's really, really interesting, because without our collaborators and our allies, the works wouldn't really happen. We need people who can think and have imaginations, and in the same way that we do, to kind of like hook in, and then it becomes a wonderful symbiotic kind of thing where it's not like somebody doing stuff to prop us up and support us or anything, but it's this great exchange, and something bigger can come out of that, and often does. And people walk away from projects, and, sometimes they can be hard and challenging and really confront your beliefs and ideals and everything. But if you kind of stick with them, you can break through and walk away with something that really can be transformative in your life. And so I think that those collaborations are really important, getting the right people on board, and that you are going to go on a journey with them, a journey of discovery, and you might learn some tools, they might learn some stuff, and you'll come out the greater in the end. I've lost people on the way, gained people on the way, and fear. You cannot be frightened of, staying in people's good books or anything. You have to listen, yes, and you have to be receptive, but also you're bloody minded. I mean, you can tell what I'm like. You have to be like that sometimes in order to make something different happen, and that is so thanks.
Thank you. I've got a couple of more questions that just popped up, and I think that there's interesting questions coming up. So we've got one very specific question from Tanya, and so we all know Tanya, I think. This is a question for Al, and he's gone, so maybe we'll have to sort of forward that on. I mean, it's a question about what graphic app do you use, and can you tell us about how you make it accessible to you? So maybe we can forward that to Al. But have either of you got any commentary on that, or any if you haven't, don't worry about it, we'll forward that on. This other question is, in a post-lockdown era when the majority of the art sector has returned to physical venues, how can we ensure that vital, accessible virtual events like this can continue and evolve, so that disabled artists and audiences can keep making and enjoying fully inclusive art? So basically, when returning to, more in-person stuff.
Yeah. I think to have hybrid events, to make sure it's still happening, because I think, just last night I was part of a webinar for an exhibition called Layers of Vision, which is at Bush House, 10 blind and partially blind artists coming together. And people could tune in last night to meet the artists. And we're all based in different places. logistically and financially that can be quite difficult sometimes. So we were online there for people to talk to all the artists. You know, it was a really, really good event. I think it was so lovely as well. And this is another thing, for disabled artists to actually spend time together, learn from each other, and that there's funding available or institutions enable that to happen, because also, you know, creatively incredible things come out of that. And I know sometimes for younger disabled artists or somebody that's just become a disabled person, seeing another disabled artist working creatively, having fun, challenging people, creating really interesting content and being visible as well, can be the difference between you feeling isolated and fed up, or between you thinking, wow, there's a whole career ahead for me, I could be part of this, and how exciting that is. And I might have to do it very differently to how I did it before, but I can do it. And that is so powerful. And I think sometimes organizations or individuals underestimate the power of us all working together and networking and having those opportunities.
Yeah, so that's one of the real sort of benefits of collaboration, and also, yeah, like you say, bringing people together, which, you know, interestingly is happens less than it used to, doesn't it? Because, you know, in the past, when we had a lot more disability arts organizations and disability arts initiatives, and I think there were more people, there was more funding, and it was just sort of big and new and exciting. And that's sort of leveled off. So yeah, go on, say.
Yeah, and I think you know, that's the pressure on the entire arts sector, isn't it? That people are having to, you know, rather than have art in their venues, have weddings, and that means that we're left out. You know, it's important because, you know, I can't afford to have a space, you know, for 20 artists to turn up and have fun together and create work. But we used to go to those big institutions who would let us use their spaces for free. And again, it's about using that technology for free, isn't it, to get our voices heard and to get us out there, really.
Yeah, and it's another channel. It's another channel to reach a lot of people.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, huge. I mean,
I also think that, sorry, just to say that I really think that it's really important that we have more opportunities like the space creates, where there is even the thinking of taking your stuff that's already been created. Al said, you know, he had a book. He had started to put some things online because he couldn't get the publisher to publish it. Then the space came in, and he was enabled to make something different and bigger out of that. And I think that the way to keep you know, this hybrid space going of virtual and physical is to be and have more opportunities where artists can reimagine their work, and believe that what they have in terms of all their accrued materials are assets, and that they could, because there's so much. So there's something I want to bring up later. I think we go on, move on to kind of what's missing or stuff, you know, because there are things, really interesting stuff that's happening with AI now, that of course we're all got, you know, kind of like AI anxiety in terms of like taking over the world. But also there's a recently I just saw something on Twitter about someone who's taken their journals from they were writing when they were a kid, a young teenager, fed it into this AI app or something, some sort of tech thing, and it's reconstructed them as a young person that they can go back now and have a interaction with, and it's actually working around their sense of trauma, and enabling them to actually heal. And I think that it's just so interesting that, you know, there are ways in which, that's what I mean in terms of how we interpret what an asset is, and how it can meet technology, and how it then can become something that gets fed out to inspire and help other people, and happening in a digital space. So yeah, kind of.
Thank you. I've got another question that I want to put to you that's come up from on the chat how do panelists manage international work? So this is something I know we've all done. I've got a lot of masterclasses or tutorials coming up for Northern Irish audiences. In Ireland, there is both ISL, which is Irish Sign Language, and BSL, British Sign Language. I don't know if I need to offer both at all sessions or whether to alternate it, because it could be distracting and overstimulating, for example, to neurodivergent sign language users. Any advice on that? I mean, that's a very specific question, so maybe if you can sort of address that briefly. And then we'll move on to talking about, you know, the changes that you'd like to see in the few minutes we've got left.
I mean, I think you need to ask those audiences about that, about whether that's 2 sessions or how that would work, because I don't want to give that, you know, that answer for those deaf audiences. What I can say though is that during COVID, I met a deaf architect who was working with an organisation in Northern Ireland, and through that work digitally and the conversations that we've had, we then went out to Braunschweig in Germany this year to build an inclusive pavilion with Disordinary Architecture that I co-direct. And I had 2 deaf architects and 10 deaf and disabled artists as part of that project. And I knew at the time, you know, we had a limited amount of funding, but I needed to capture it digitally so that I could share that with other people rather than just have this one project happen in this one place. And we've managed to, you know, have captions and have sign language on that piece to go out, because the deaf people are there signing on film. And the other day, for the Royal Institute of British Architects in the north of England, we played that film, we launched it, and 180 people, architects, tuned in to hear the 2 deaf architects and deaf artists that we had. And they said, you know, it was one of the best CPD sessions they'd ever had. And I just thought, you know, I had to beg and borrow to get the funding to get that captured on film. But thank goodness I did, because, and it was such a minimal amount of money really, but it enabled, you know, to continue that legacy. And I think, as Maria is saying, there's all sorts of resources there ready to go, but we just need the funding and the digital infrastructure to enable us to continue to share it, really.
Thanks, Zoe. Thank you. There's just a couple of things there's some information in chat that hopefully that will be shared, I believe, by Space afterwards in the next couple of weeks. We've got a message here that Cryptic Arts also have a great guide for creating hybrid events, and also Unlimited, the organisation that came out of London 2012 and the Paralympic opening ceremony. Unlimited also has a report and a simple guide to artists using social media, and the link is in the chat. So that's that. Yeah, so somebody's asked, is it possible to save the chat? Yes, I think it is being saved and will be distributed afterwards. Yeah, or it says if anybody wants a copy of the chat, please email events@thespace.org. Okay. Right, so I want to finally move to the sort of changes that, if anybody would like to put in the chat the changes that you'd like to see for sort of evolving the sort of digital work and digital platforms, please do put them in. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask both Zoe and Maria to give us their ideas about what changed. I think you've already come up with quite a few, so maybe if you can sort of summarize them and any new ideas that you've got, you know, about
Me?
Yes, Maria, we'll start with you, and
yeah,
then,
just I mean, I don't really have changes. We've talked about kind of like, you know, as Zoe said, infrastructure and funding, and also thinking, you know, like really enabling disabled people, and also people who want to work with disabled people to free up your thinking, you know. That's where it all starts, you know. But the other thing I think is really great, and I think would be good as well to kind of lock into, is like how we could get more involved in gaming, and how gaming can really kind of like open up some of the ways in which we can traverse new ways of telling stories in immersive and interactive ways, but with a disability aesthetic. I think that's the kind of change that I want to see. And also, like, the thing that I think was just this revelation that I experienced, you know, in this description of the way that, you know, AI can be employed to create almost like another kind of dimension for us, almost like a kind of time portal, really, to revisit ourselves. I think it's just amazing. It's blown my mind. So it's really exciting, and all of those changes. But in terms of
sorry, Maria, what's the time portal? Can you explain?
That's the thing that I was talking about before, about this the way in which AI has been used to enable a revisiting of this researcher's younger self.
So AI, artificial intelligence.
Yeah. That's all ways in which I'd love to see change, but also with disabled people very much at the heart of the inclusive kind of rollout of anything, and brought into those conversations from the very start for me.
Okay. Zoe.
Similar to Maria, really. I think it's disabled artists and creators and consultants and people with experience being present in those decision-making circles. So we're talking, you know, at DCMS level, we're talking at Arts Council level, and then we're talking within those institutions that represent all of us within society, but also making sure that people are open to doing things in a different way, and sometimes doing it in a different way is actually more, you know, more groundbreaking, and more people enjoy it, not just disabled people, everybody. And I think, you know, it's there's a lot of guidance out there. It's fantastic that people are putting it forward, but for me, it's about all that guidance is out there and you can go and find it, but people don't. And it's trying to understand what is the tipping point that we encourage people to have a go and not be fearful of having a go. You know, I think sometimes we just really need to recognize sometimes getting it wrong, you learn a lot more than just not doing it. And I say, you know, it's really important that you have a go and involve a disabled person, you know, ask them, because often organisations say they can't find these disabled people that they want to work with. If you ask one disabled artist to network you in, I am sure they could come up with another 25, 50 artists that you could be working with that have that experience and that authentic way of working.
Yeah, it's an interesting, it's a question that comes up a lot, isn't it? Is how do we get in touch with disabled people? How do we find disabled artists? And I think it's certainly true that now it's a lot more likely, or a lot easier, that you will, if you put it out there that you want to work and talk about accessibility, not just in relation to sort of, you know, one or two disabled people, but in relation to your entire organization. It's like everybody's been saying, it's not the sort of add-on, it's to be truly inclusive. It's something that you do throughout the organization, for a range of.
And at board level, those conversations should be going on regularly as part of the DNA of that organisation, you know, and all the way down and all the way up as well.
Yeah, well, which would also mean, you know, trying to recruit disabled people and disabled expertise into your board. Yeah.
And perhaps boards need to work in a different way, because perhaps sometimes, you know, board meetings are inaccessible to some disabled people, and we need to reframe it all, maybe.
Okay. Yeah. So right, so you've both talked about the changes you'd like to see. I'm going to give you just 1 or 2 minutes each just to sort of sum up any final ideas and thoughts that you've had while we've been talking today. And there are some links that also have come up in the chat that people can get access to as well. Okay, so Maria, if you'd like to summarize first.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been wonderful. Wonderful, actually. The being invited onto panel made me go back and look at flight paths. And I was saying earlier that often you get so immersed in making a work that it overwhelms you, and then you just leave it alone and run away and sort of have a rest or go on to the next project. So to go back, and then it was great. And just in watching it, I kind of had a sense of how from the outside, which time had enabled me to have this gap. So I was able to sort of appreciate it from the outside, but also to understand all the work that had gone into it from behind and where it had all come from. So that was great. It's been really interesting to hear about, and I just feel that this is such a rich area. There's so many ways that our stories and underrepresented voices can be given the space to be present, and be present in a really creative and authentic ways. So this is just great, just the beginning. And also just in terms of the international, being given the opportunity to create flight paths in a digital way means that it's available to everybody. It's also, it's become a kind of a revenue stream for us. So we've now we've won awards from it, which is great, but also been paid, even though it's open access and anyone can, we've been paid to show the films of that were contained in it at the Japanese Embassy, in a Mexico Film Festival. Recently, Dada Fest have paid for it to be part of their digital so it continues to be the gift that keeps on giving. So thank you very much for space.
Yeah, and just to remind people, you mentioned Dada Fest. That's on at the moment, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
I believe.
Yes.
So if you're interested, you can find Dada Fest online. And there are lots of different things happening there. I can hear your dogs there. So if you can,
And by the way, I've just shared the link for that AI project, so it's there in the chat so people can connect with it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Maria. Just before you do, Zoe, I'll just read this out. So somebody's saying they agree with you regarding the board, and at Level Centre we now only produce easy read board papers, and 50% of our board are disabled, but we still have a long way to go to shake up what a board can do versus its obligation as a charity, and also monitoring. So thank you for that. Yeah, brilliant. We've got the link for Dada Fest up there in the chat, so that's very good. And Harmeet said, and also user testing, play testing, and thinking about user experience in the design process is also crucial in the chat. So it is about, checking with people, asking people, being interactive, don't make assumptions about what people need,
and paying people for their time as well.
Oh, absolutely, Maria. Yeah, don't think that we do freebies for everybody all the time.
Just to get us out of the house. Yeah. Nice cup of tea.
Yeah, nice to see us out and about. So somebody actually said that to me in a group of disabled women friends when we were in a restaurant. They actually went out on their way out the restaurant. They diverted, came over to our table and looked at us and said, "So lovely to see you out and about." So I said, "It is, isn't it? You're going to pay as well." Zoe, I'm going to give you 1 minute just to sort of wrap up, and then we're going to move on to the last part.
Yeah, I think this just looks back to some of the international work as well. I find that I mean, recently I've taken something called Domestic Landscapes, which some of it is digital, and playing around with having virtual galleries online, which I can draw more people to look at probably than I could if I was in, a space somewhere. But on that international work, very quickly, Spanish TV and a really important art program wanted to take the digital films of my audio descriptions translated into BSL, so me working with deaf artists, and that film then telling the story of domestic objects through disabled women's stories. They just thought it was amazing, and very quickly that's gone out to thousands of people across Spain. And I just think, I'd love to see that in the UK. I'd love people to embrace what we do much more and understand why it can be so interesting. Sherlock, sorry about that. And I think it's just come and talk to us, come and ask us, get people involved. I think that's the bottom line. And very
Absolutely.
quickly, new things will happen. I think that's the exciting thing. And also, just to say, like you say, backing up, we are professionals. We do have busy schedules, I suppose, and just making sure that we've got the space and time to reflect with organisations is really important, so that the one-offs don't work. This is about a journey over a long period of time.
Yeah.
And like Maria said, as soon as you start, the more exciting it becomes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. We've got one last little bit with, I'm going to hand back to Linda for this. So we're going to, there's going to be an evaluation of the session. So just to thank everybody for coming, to thank our wonderful speakers, and we hope we'll be able to connect with you all again soon.
Thank you very much.
Great, a fantastic conversation there. So just as Barbara said, before you go, we do ask you to fill in the evaluation, because it's just so helpful to us in terms of the funding of the whole programme, and also understanding what we could do differently, what we could improve upon. So I think the link will be in chat if it isn't already, and just take a minute or two before you go off to fill that in. Thank you all. I can see there's still people doing the evaluation, so I think the last thing really is just to plug that we do have another webinar lined up for I think it's the 8th of December. We're looking at use of branching narrative, and looking at 2 different case studies of organisations who've used it, for the organisations and individual artists who've used it for the first time. So perhaps we'll put a link into chat for that as well, so those of you who don't know about it. There we go. Thank you. And thanks to Barbara as well for commendable facilitation and keeping the conversation going. Much appreciated. Thank you. Thank you. That's it.
And we kept to time.
Certainly did. Okay. Thank you.
There's always more to say, but another time.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye bye.